Christmas music floated softly through the restaurant, all warm strings and distant choirs, while outside the windows the city shimmered with cold December light. Emma stood for a second in the doorway, smoothing the cheap red dress she had bought on clearance, pretending not to notice how the host gave her a quick, assessing glance. Couples in dark suits and glittering dresses leaned over candles and wine, the smell of roasted meat and cinnamon drifting through the air like a promise she could barely afford. She told the host her name, heard it repeated with a polished smile, and felt a tiny, foolish spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, this Christmas Eve would hurt a little less than the others. The host led her through the maze of white tablecloths, and that was when she saw them, 3 familiar faces at a table near the back, half hidden by a pillar, half hidden by their own smugness. Her co-workers lifted their glasses in a lazy, almost secret toast, as if she couldn't possibly notice them. One of them already had his phone in his hand, angled in a way that could be passed off as casual. But Emma knew the way young men held their phones when they were getting ready to be entertained. She forced herself to keep walking, heels clicking on the tile, pretending she didn't feel like she had stepped onto a stage she hadn't auditioned for. Her date sat waiting at a table by the window, framed by the glow of Christmas lights reflected in the glass. He was handsome in a clean, understated way, navy shirt crisp against his shoulders, dark hair combed with an almost old-fashioned care. He looked up when she approached, smiled a little too quickly, then dropped his gaze again, as if bracing himself. Emma's heart stumbled. It had been a long time since anyone had been nervous to meet her. She slid into the chair opposite him, her hands folding around the edge of the napkin as if it were something to hold on to. "Hi, I'm Emma," she said, voice softer than she meant, the words tumbling out with the nervousness she tried to hide. Across from her he watched her lips move, then nodded, smiling in a way that didn't quite match the rhythm of the moment. She glanced sideways, just for a heartbeat, and caught the flash of a raised phone, the shimmer of a ring light reflection in a wineglass, the curve of a mouth already fighting a laugh. Heat crept up her neck, but she swallowed it back down like old medicine, determined not to give them what they wanted. She tried again, speaking a little louder, asking something simple about his day, the weather, anything to break the awkwardness circling the table like a fly. The man frowned, leaning slightly closer, his eyes still fixed on her mouth, then shook his head with an apologetic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Behind her, a chair scraped the floor, followed by a muffled snicker and the soft, unmistakable sound of a recording starting. Emma's fingers tightened around the napkin, the cheap fabric biting into her skin as if to remind her she was still there. That was when she noticed it. A small, flesh-colored device tucked behind his ear, the faint outline of molded plastic against his skin. Her breath snagged in her throat, a single sharp pause that seemed to stretch across the table and swallow the music, the laughter, the clinking glassware. Memories she had buried under years of bills and double shifts surged up. A boy with big eyes and quick hands, a hospital room filled with soft beeping and the slow, patient dance of fingers spelling, "I'm here." Her gaze flicked from the hearing aid to the phones aimed at them, to the gleam of satisfaction in the eyes of men who thought this was clever. The truth dropped into her chest with a cold, metallic finality. They had chosen him on purpose. Not because they believed she deserved kindness, but because they thought her loneliness and his silence would make good content, the kind that could be edited with silly music and mean captions for people to laugh at in the dark. The restaurant suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier, her throat tighter than it had been in years. For a heartbeat she imagined standing up, turning on them, shattering the polished hush of the room with the full volume of her fury. But another image rose instead, Lily's face that afternoon, hopeful and shy, asking if the man would be nice to her mother. the memory of her brother's small hand in hers, trembling but determined, as he learned the first clumsy letters in the air. Emma closed her eyes for a second, breathing past the sting behind them, feeling the humiliating heat in her cheeks begin to cool into something else, something steady, something stubborn. Anger could set the room on fire, but it would burn her first, and it wouldn't give him back his dignity or hers. She opened her eyes and let her hand slip free from the napkin, fingers uncurling like someone stepping out from behind a locked door. The man watched her, puzzled, his smile cautious but kind, clearly aware only that something was wrong without knowing the shape of it. Emma took one more breath, feeling the tremor in her chest move down into her arms, her wrists, the tips of her fingers. Then, very slowly, she lifted her hands to the space between them, as if she were placing a lantern on the table. Her fingers began to move, shaky at first, the old signs stiff from years of disuse. "I'm sorry," she spelled clumsily, her hand spelling out the apology that her voice couldn't carry without breaking. "They did something cruel," she added, stumbling over the sign for cruel, correcting it mid-air, cheeks wet now without her realizing when the tears had slipped free. His eyes widened, the confusion melting into startled recognition, then into a look so soft and startled that it made her want to look away and stare at the same time. Behind her, the laughter thinned and then faltered like a song played on a dying battery. Phones still pointed at the table, but the angle of the men's shoulders changed, an uneasy stiffness replacing their earlier ease. They had expected muttered awkwardness, maybe a scene, perhaps a storming exit they could catch from 3 angles. They had not expected Emma's hands to cut through the air like this, filling the space between her and the man with a language that didn't need their permission. The restaurant seemed to lean in as the candle between them flickered, stretching their shadows across the white tablecloth. Emma kept signing, halting but determined, explaining that she hadn't known, that she hadn't agreed to be part of their joke, that she refused to let him be the punchline of their boredom. Her hands shook, her chest hurt, but each movement felt like stitching something torn back together, one slow, careful thread at a time. Daniel, she would learn his name a little later, but already it rested in the shape of his face in her mind. Nodded, swallowing hard, his own fingers beginning to rise to answer her. Around them, the room grew quiet enough that even those who couldn't read the signs could feel that something important was being said. In the glow of the Christmas lights and the faint reflection of 3 phones, suddenly lowered a little closer to the table, Emma realized that whatever this night had been meant to be, it would no longer belong to the men who thought they were directing it. And somewhere, in the space between her trembling hands and his steady gaze, the story of that evening began to change in a way that none of them, not even Emma, could yet imagine. The music kept playing, but for Emma it was as if someone had turned the volume down on the whole world. She could still see the pianist moving his hands over the keys, could still see couples talking, laughing, leaning close. But all of it felt far away, like something happening behind glass, right in front of her. Only one thing mattered: the way the man across from her was staring at her hands, eyes wide and shining, as if he were seeing a miracle and an accident at the same time. His lips parted, and a breath she couldn't hear escaped him, but she recognized the emotion on his face, surprised gratitude threaded with old hurt. Slowly, he lifted his own hands, the candlelight catching the faint tremor in his fingers. "Thank you," he signed, the movement clear and practiced, more graceful than hers. "You sign?" The question was small, but it cracked something open in the air between them. Emma nodded, swallowing, her cheeks still wet, the napkin damp and wrinkled in her lap. She spelled out, clumsy as a beginner, that she had a brother once, a little boy who had needed his big sister to talk to the world for him, and that she was out of practice. He blinked at that, the softness in his gaze deepening into something almost reverent. "My name is Daniel," he mouthed carefully as he signed it too, fingers tracing the pattern of his name in the space between them. Emma watched the shape of it, feeling it settle in her chest like a stone that somehow made her steadier instead of heavier. She repeated it back to him, her hands slow but accurate, and his smile tilted, a little crooked with emotion. Behind her, a fork clinked against a plate, a chair scraped, someone cleared a throat, but she didn't turn to look. She was done chasing the meaning in other people's eyes tonight. "They did this?" he asked then, a short, sharp cluster of signs, his gaze flicking over her shoulder and returning quickly, as if he didn't want to give the men at the other table more of his attention than they deserved. Emma hesitated, shame burning again at the base of her neck because the truth tasted sour on her tongue, even if her hands could speak it more cleanly. She nodded and signed yes, then added joke with a twist to the gesture that came out more bitter than she intended. His jaw tightened, not just at the insult to himself, she realized, but at what it said about the people she spent her days with. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two strangers pushed into a performance neither had auditioned for. Emma felt the old instinct rising, the one that had protected her through years of thoughtless remarks and backhanded pity. Smile, make light of it, pretend it doesn't hurt. But the sight of the phone still hovering in the edge of her vision, of a face half hidden and half grinning behind it, made something inside her go very still instead. She let the mask slip all the way off, just this once, and Daniel saw the real, raw ache she usually kept hidden from everyone. "I'm sorry," she signed again, this time not just for the setup, but for every careless moment that had led them here. "Not your fault," he answered, his hands firm and steady, the motion almost fierce. "Not mine either." His gaze held hers, steady and searching, as if he were offering her those words to keep, like a coat she could wrap around herself when the cold of humiliation tried to seep back in. Emma's shoulders loosened by a fraction, as if some invisible weight had shifted just enough for her to breathe. The waiter approached then, moving more slowly than before, his eyes flickering from Emma's damp lashes to Daniel's hearing aid, then toward the table where the three men sat suddenly very interested in their bread baskets. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice low, careful, respectful. Emma glanced at Daniel, letting him see the question in her face before she answered. Daniel gave the faintest nod, and Emma turned back to the waiter with a small, controlled smile. "We're fine," she said softly, then added in a whisper, "but they're recording us without permission." The waiter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for the first time that evening Emma saw an adult in the room who wasn't amused. "I understand," he murmured, inclining his head, and drifted away, not to disappear, but to speak quietly with the manager near the bar. It was a small thing, but it felt like a candle being lit somewhere in the dark, a signal that the whole world wasn't made of people who laughed at others' pain. Emma exhaled slowly, watching Daniel follow the waiter's movement with his eyes, then look back at her with a question that wasn't quite about the video anymore. "Does this happen a lot?" He signed, the gesture broad enough to mean more than just tonight, more like to you and in this place and in this life. Emma hesitated, then nodded once, hands moving carefully as she explained in short, broken phrases about the jokes at work, the assumptions, the way people talked about her as if poverty and motherhood made her less of a person and more of a story to tell at lunch. There was no self-pity in the way she signed it, just a tired, matter-of-fact honesty that hurt more because it was so calm. Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his eyes darkening with a quiet anger that had nothing to do with himself now. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of it above the tablecloth. "You are not a joke," he signed slowly, each movement deliberate, as if he wanted the sentence to leave a mark she wouldn't be able to scrub away later. "They showed who they are. You showed who you are." The words sat between them, heavy and simple, and Emma felt something inside her straighten in response, like a picture frame finally hung level after years of tilting. For the first time that night, the humiliation loosened its grip, replaced by a fragile but stubborn kind of pride. Around them, the restaurant had settled into a hush that wasn't quite normal. Conversations had softened, eyes slid away and back again, people pretending not to watch while not wanting to miss what might happen next. Emma could feel their attention, the way a person feels sunlight on their skin, even through a window. She knew she could end it now by walking out, leaving the broken pieces where they lay, and taking the story home as just another wound to hide. Or she could stay, keep her hands moving, and choose what this night would mean, for her, for Daniel, and for the men still clutching their phones like shields behind her chairs. And as she sat there in the stolen glow of their cruel little stage, Emma realized that the next choice she made would decide whether this would be remembered as a joke or as something else entirely. Morning in Emma's apartment did not begin with sunlight. It began with the alarm on her old phone, buzzing against a chipped nightstand. The winter sky outside was still a flat, stubborn grey, and the radiator hissed and clanged like it was complaining about being awake too. Emma lay there for one extra breath, listening to the quiet of the small place before the day filled it. In that moment, she could almost pretend life was not a constant math problem of hours and dollars and worries. Then she swung her legs out of bed, feet finding the familiar cold patch on the floor, and the pretending was over. The living room doubled as Lily's playroom and as a hallway to everything else, cramped but clean, decorated with paper snowflakes and a crooked construction paper wreath. Lily was already awake, hair a wild halo, standing on the threadbare rug and practicing her Christmas song in a small, earnest voice. "We wish you a Merry Christmas," came out a little off-key, but with such effort that Emma could not help but smile. She kissed her daughter's forehead and straightened the T-shirt that served as pajamas, tucking in the tag where it scratched Lily's neck. "Finish the song while I get your cereal, superstar," she said, the word superstar like a tiny shield she wrapped around the child. In the kitchen, the cupboards offered their nightly confession: half a box of cereal, some pasta, a can of soup, the last of the milk. Emma measured everything with the eye of someone who could not afford mistakes. She poured just enough milk that Lily's bowl wouldn't feel empty, then added a splash of water to stretch what remained for her coffee. The kettle rattled, steam rising like a ghost of better mornings, and Emma let herself imagine, just for a second, how it might feel to open a fridge without doing mental arithmetic. Then Lily's voice reached her again, reaching bravely for the high notes, and the day pulled her back to what mattered most. On the tiny, wobbling kitchen table, Lily's school books were stacked beside a jar of coins labelled "Field Trip" in shaky marker. Emma sat for exactly 6 minutes with her coffee, watching Lily carefully colour in a worksheet snowman with a blue scarf, because blue was her favourite, even though the directions said red. 6 minutes to be just a mother, not an employee or a bill payer or anyone's joke. She tucked Lily's hair into 2 lopsided braids, promising silently that the child would never feel the kind of smallness her mother endured. Then, with the practiced choreography of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, she zipped the backpack, found the missing glove behind the couch, and ushered them both out into the cold. The bus ride to school was a blur of damp coats and fogged windows, the city still waking up under a layer of dirty snow. Emma held the metal pole with one hand and Lily's fingers with the other, swaying with each stop. When they reached the school, Lily squeezed her hand hard. "You'll be here for the Christmas concert, right?" the little girl asked, eyes as serious as if she were signing a contract. Emma swallowed the lump that always rose when her schedule flashed in her mind like an angry warning. "I'll be there," she said, because somehow, some way, she always made that part come true, even if it meant skipping dinner or running between buses in the dark. After dropping Lily off, Emma caught another bus in the opposite direction, toward the glass and metal building where she spent most of her waking hours. The tech company's lobby smelled of polished floors and expensive coffee, a different universe from her apartment, even though the ride between them was less than 40 minutes. She swiped her badge at the turnstile, the reader blinking green with indifferent approval, and joined the stream of employees flowing toward their stations. The customer support floor was a grey sea of cubicles, each one decorated with tiny hints of the person trapped inside: photos, mugs, sticky notes. Emma's space had Lily's drawings taped to the partition and a small framed picture of a boy with dark hair and bright eyes. Her brother's photo was the only thing she owned that looked new. She had saved for months to buy the frame. In it, he looked about 10, serious but playful, his head tilted slightly as if he were listening with his whole body. Emma remembered teaching him his name in sign, slowly spelling each letter, laughing when he mixed them up, cheering when he got it right. She remembered hospital hallways and the beep of machines, the way she had used her hands to tell him stories when he was too tired to read them himself. After he was gone, she had tried to pack those memories into a quiet corner of her mind, but they never stayed there. They surfaced in unexpected moments, like whenever she saw a hearing aid or felt the itch in her fingers to sign a word instead of say it. At her desk, the headset felt heavier some days than others. She answered call after call from strangers who only heard her as a voice to complain to, never as a person holding a life together on the edge. "Yes, sir, I understand your frustration. I'm so sorry, ma'am. Let me see what I can do." The script slid off her tongue automatically, the words like a uniform she wore in her mouth. Between calls, she glanced at the company chat, where people posted memes and gossip. Sometimes she found her own department mentioned, light jokes about the basement crew and the sympathy hires. She pretended not to see, because acknowledging it meant admitting how deeply it stung. The three men from upstairs, Matt, Jordan, and Luis, liked to appear at her cubicle during the slower hours, leaning on the partition as if it were the bar of a club she'd never be allowed into. They were funny, in that easy, careless way that didn't cost them anything. "Emma, you can't spend Christmas Eve alone again," Jordan had said one day, tossing a foam stress ball from hand to hand. "It's tragic, like one of those commercials with sad music and puppies." The others laughed, not cruelly yet, just thoughtlessly. Emma had smiled, the kind of smile that did not reach her eyes, and joked that her ideal date was a quiet night and a long bath she didn't have to share with Lily's toys. But jokes bred plans in their world. Over the following week, she heard little pieces of conversation float past her like scraps of paper in a hallway. Talk of dating apps, of fixing Emma up, of making sure she finally had a story to tell. Audrey, a couple of times, she turned a corner and the laughter died too quickly. The phones slid too fast into pockets. When she asked what they were scheming, Jordan only grinned and told her to trust them, that they were angels of mercy in cheap office chairs. She wanted to say no, to shut the door on whatever ridiculous idea they had, but a small part of her was tired of going home alone to the same four walls and the same silent worries. One evening, as she gathered her coat and shut down her computer, she passed the break room and heard her own name through the half-open door. Instinct told her to keep walking, but years of being overlooked had left her with a stubborn need to know. She paused, just out of sight, heart knocking gently against her ribs. Inside, the three men were hunched over a phone, their voices low but charged with excitement. "Christmas Eve," Matt was saying. "Fancy place, perfect lighting. This is going to be the best thing we've done all year." Jordan laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "She has no idea. It's the perfect Christmas surprise." Emma stood there, fingers curling into the strap of her bag, the words "perfect Christmas surprise" echoing in her chest like a warning bell she couldn't yet interpret. For a second, she imagined presents, flowers, something kind and ordinary. Then she remembered the way their jokes always came with a twist that cut deeper than they meant to admit. She stepped back from the door before they could see her, the hallway suddenly feeling longer and colder than before. As she walked toward the elevator, their laughter followed her, bouncing off the walls, and she had the strange, shivering feeling that her quiet, predictable life was about to be pulled into a story she hadn't written, and whose ending she could not yet see. The first whisper arrived the same way all big news did in the company, through an offhand comment made too loudly in the elevator. Emma was pressed between winter coats and briefcases when a man from finance muttered to a colleague, "If this investor goes through with it, half of us will be polishing resumes by February." The word investor hung in the air like a draft, slipping in under collars and into conversations. By the time Emma reached her floor, the rumor had already grown teeth and wings. On the support level, where the lights always felt a little harsher and the chairs a little cheaper, the talk filtered down with a mixture of dread and hope. Some people dreamed out loud about bonuses and raises. Others counted imaginary severance packages they might not even get. Emma listened while she reset her headset and pulled up the first ticket of the day. For her, the math was simpler and harsher. A job was rent, food, and school shoes for Lily. The idea of someone, somewhere, deciding her future with a stroke of a pen made her stomach knot. At lunch, the break room hummed with speculation. "I heard he's some kind of genius in tech," one woman said, unwrapping her sandwich. No, he's one of those silent types, never gives interviews," another insisted. "They say he cares about numbers, not people." Emma sat at the corner of the table with her microwaved leftovers, nodding when appropriate, but mostly watching the steam rise from her food. She wondered if a man like that would ever even know that the support floor existed, much less that it was full of people who stayed late to fix what other departments broke. The three men who orbited her days, Matt, Jordan, and Luis, wore their anxiety like cologne, obvious, but disguised under too loud jokes. "If this guy's buying us," Jordan announced, dropping into the chair across from Emma, "I'm upgrading my dreams. Corner office, actual window, chair that doesn't squeak like a dying squirrel." The others laughed, but there was a tightness in their eyes. Emma smiled faintly, remembering the year she had dared to hope for a small raise and gotten a branded mug instead. Dreams, she had learned, were safer when they were small and private. Later that afternoon, during a rare, quiet stretch between calls, the three of them descended on her cubicle as if they had rehearsed the entrance. Luis leaned on the partition, Matt spun a spare chair around and straddled it backward, and Jordan perched on the edge of her desk, tapping a pen against his knee. "Emma," he began in the tone of someone about to offer a great favor, "we've decided we can't let you spend Christmas Eve alone. It's morally wrong." His grin said he was only half joking. The other half was something sharper. She laughed, but it was a small, cautious sound. "I won't be alone. I'll be with Lily. That's enough." Matt shook his head dramatically. "Kid or not, you deserve some adult conversation that isn't someone yelling about their internet speed." Luis chimed in. "Come on, just one date. Think of it as employee wellness. You go, you eat something that wasn't frozen first. You talk to an actual grown man. Revolutionary." Their eyes shone with a mix of mischief and salesmanship, like boys trying to convince a friend to jump in a lake before they admitted how cold it was. Emma hesitated, her cursor blinking on the half-written email on her screen. She knew how these things went, a lot of teasing, a mediocre night, and weeks of jokes afterward about how desperate she must have been. But beneath her caution was a quieter ache she rarely let herself feel, the longing to be looked at as a woman, not just a mother or a co-worker, not just a problem solver with dark circles under her eyes. "I don't even have time to meet anyone," she murmured. And who would you find willing to go out on Christmas Eve? That, Jordan said, flourishing his phone like a magician revealing a card, is already handled. He turned the screen toward her just enough for Emma to see a dating app's familiar layout, a blurred profile picture, and the outline of a reserved table icon. We've got connections. You just have to show up. We pick a nice guy, you get a nice evening. No tricks. The word tricks rang a little false in her ears, but she was tired, and the idea of sitting in a nice place where no one needed her to solve anything for a couple of hours was dangerously appealing. She drew a slow breath, weighing the risk in the same mental scale she used for overdue bills and bus schedules. Lily would be with a neighbor who adored her and had already invited them over for cocoa after church. One evening away would not break the world. And if the date went badly, she could leave early, go home, and turn the story into something they could both laugh about someday. "All right," she said finally, feeling both braver and more foolish than she liked. "One dinner. That's it." The men exchanged quick, triumphant glances that she pretended not to see. As they walked away, already huddled around Jordan's phone, their voices dropped to a conspiratorial murmur, and Emma turned back to her screen, trying to focus on the next customer's complaint. On the far wall of the office, a bulletin board held a cheerful poster about company culture. Words like respect, integrity, and community printed in bright, hopeful colors. She stared at it for a moment longer than usual, feeling a faint chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Somewhere above this floor, a stranger with money was preparing to judge the value of the entire company. Somewhere much closer, three men were planning a different kind of judgment, one they thought would stay safely between their phones and their laughter. Emma had no way of knowing yet that both stories, the investor and the joke, were already on a collision course with her quiet life. The week before Christmas slid through the office with the quiet tension of a storm gathering behind glass, subtle, restless, humming with whispers that didn't quite make sense yet. Emma felt it the way a person feels cold coming through a door that hasn't opened, instinctively, uneasily, without knowing why. Jordan, Matt, and Luis kept drifting around her cubicle with a charged kind of energy, the kind that didn't come from kindness, but from anticipation. She told herself not to read too much into it, to accept that maybe, for once, they were actually trying to do something thoughtful, but hope, even small hope, was a dangerous softness. On Wednesday afternoon, while Emma coached a customer through resetting a stubborn password, she noticed Matt and Luis slipping into a small meeting room with the blinds half closed. Through the sliver of glass, she saw the glow of a phone illuminating their faces, their shoulders shaking with laughter, their heads pressed close in the posture of people hiding delight. She couldn't hear the words, but she recognized the gestures, the eager scrolling, the tapping, the nudging elbows. Something about the secrecy pricked at her nerves, but she pushed it aside, telling herself she was simply tired. Later that night, after putting Lily to bed, Emma opened the dating app she hadn't touched in months. The moment she logged in, she saw it. Messages sent without her, swipes she didn't make, choices she didn't approve. Her coworkers had taken control of the account like it was a toy. And there he was, the man they had selected for her. Daniel. His profile photo was simple, a calm expression, a steady gaze, a hint of seriousness softening into warmth. There was something honest in his eyes, something unpolished and real, but beneath that warmth, an unease crept through her. Did he know he'd been chosen like a pawn in someone else's game? Did he understand he'd been drafted into a joke he didn't consent to? Emma closed the phone, pressing it face down on the sofa cushion. If she backed out now, the men would taunt her for weeks, say she was dramatic, ungrateful, humorless. She hated that part of her life, the balancing act between dignity and survival, between boundaries and the small humiliations she had grown accustomed to. She checked on Lily, smoothing the blanket over her small body, whispering a promise she wasn't sure she could keep, that everything would be fine, that Mommy would be safe, that grown-ups knew how to be kind. But even as the promise left her mouth, something inside her tightened. The next morning, the three men were already gathered around Jordan's desk when Emma arrived. "Tonight's the night," Jordan said, his grin bright and easy, masking something sharper beneath. When Emma asked for the reservation time again, they confirmed it with exaggerated patience, as if she were a child asking too many questions. "Emma," Matt said, leaning back in his chair, "this is going to be the best Christmas Eve you've had in years. Trust us." Their confidence was too rehearsed, too smooth. It felt like wrapping paper hiding a trap. During her lunch break, Emma sat alone in the lobby with a paper cup of coffee warming her palms. Outside, the December wind slapped against the glass, rattling the metal frame. She watched people pass, couples laughing, co-workers chatting, shoppers hurrying with bright red bags. They all looked like they had a place to be. She wondered where she belonged in a world that moved so easily without her. A part of her wanted to cancel the whole thing, to go home early, make hot chocolate with Lily, and forget that loneliness ever had a voice. But another part, the part that still believed in small miracles, whispered, "Maybe it won't be awful. Maybe you deserve one quiet night." By the end of the day, the decision felt made for her. She left the office with her coat pulled tight around her, and the reservation details folded into her pocket like a fragile hope. The men had chosen a restaurant she would never have chosen for herself. One with crystal glasses and prices she didn't even want to imagine. "Dress nicely," Jordan had said with a playful wink. "First impressions matter." Emma thought of her simple red dress, the one she had bought last year on clearance, and told herself it was enough. She had always made enough stretch farther than most people imagined. That evening, after Lily was safely with the neighbor, Emma stood in front of her bathroom mirror, brushing mascara onto lashes that trembled with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite excitement. The red dress fit a little tighter around the ribs than she remembered. The fabric was familiar, worn, but she smoothed it down anyway, trying to feel like a woman instead of a mother, trying to escape her worries for a few hours. She whispered a promise to her reflection, just one dinner, nothing more. Then she stepped into the cold December night, her breath rising in small white clouds as she walked toward the bus stop. City lights blinked against the dark sky, casting reflections on the wet pavement. For a brief moment, Emma felt the faint flutter of anticipation. Fragile, foolish, but real. Maybe the night would surprise her in a way she could survive. But as she boarded the bus, miles behind her, three men hovered over a group chat filled with laughing emojis and one final message glowing on their screens. "Cameras ready for tonight, boys?" And the betrayal she hadn't yet seen was already in motion. The city felt sharper on Christmas Eve, as if every light and every gust of wind held an edge. Emma stepped off the bus, clutching her coat closed with one hand, her red dress tucked safely beneath it, the hem brushing against her knees. She had hoped the night air would steady her, calm the tremor that had been building in her chest all day, but instead the cold seemed to amplify everything. Her uncertainty, her loneliness, her stubborn desire to believe this night could still turn out kind. The restaurant rose before her, like something from a movie, warm yellow lights glowing behind tall windows, garland wrapped around polished railings, soft music drifting out each time the door opened and closed. It was the kind of place she used to walk past without slowing down, the kind of place people like her didn't step into unless they were celebrating something rare, something earned. She hesitated just a moment at the entrance, smoothing her dress again, telling herself she belonged wherever she chose to be. Pride didn't pay rent, but tonight It was the only armor she had. Inside, the air was warm and scented with rosemary and butter. Couples whispered across candlelit tables. Waiters glided between them, carrying trays like choreography, and every corner sparkled with holiday decorations placed with deliberate elegance. Emma felt instantly out of place. Her shoes were too worn, her purse too small, her coat too thin. A woman in a sequined dress glanced at her and then away, the kind of glance that said more than words ever could. Emma stood a little straighter, refusing to let the judgment settle in her bones. The host looked up with a reserved smile when she approached. "Reservation for Emma?" he asked, scanning the list. She nodded, feeling a strange, fluttering weight in her chest as he gestured toward the dining area. She followed him through the maze of tables, her eyes catching flashes of polished silverware, crystal glasses, and the faint glow of hidden cameras in her peripherals. The phones she knew were aimed at her already from somewhere behind her. Then she saw him. Daniel, sitting alone at a table near the window, the soft light outlining his profile. He looked up when the host approached, and a gentle, uncertain smile flickered across his face the moment he saw her. He stood slightly, politely as she reached the table, and Emma felt a rush of warmth she hadn't expected. This was not a cruel man. This was not someone who deserved to be part of a joke. She felt her pulse skip, not from fear but from recognition. Something familiar in the set of his shoulders, the carefulness in his expression, the quiet way he took up space without demanding it. "Hi," Emma said softly as she sat, smoothing the napkin across her lap. Daniel nodded, smiling back, but the way he watched her lips made something in her stomach twist. She tried again, asking a simple question, but he didn't respond in the rhythm she expected. She spoke louder, her cheeks warming, but his reaction remained slightly off. She felt clumsy, awkward, suddenly aware of every inch of herself. And then, from behind her, she heard it, a barely suppressed snicker, the unmistakable sound of a phone camera being adjusted, the soft whisper of someone saying, "This is gonna be good." Emma's heart dropped to her stomach. Her eyes flicked toward the source without turning her head. 3 silhouettes at a table tucked behind a pillar, shoulders shaking with barely contained laughter. It was them. Of course it was them. A waiter passed by, and Emma used the moment to breathe deeply, to steady the tremor beginning to crawl into her hands. She searched Daniel's face again, really looked this time, and noticed the small, flesh-colored device behind his ear. A hearing aid. How had she not seen it sooner? How had they known? Why had they chosen him? Humiliation pulsed hot beneath her skin, rising like a tide she couldn't stop. She tried to speak again, slower this time, gentler, but Daniel's response came with an apologetic tilt of his head, the kind that broke her heart instead of frustrating her. She felt her throat tighten. This wasn't awkwardness. This was a cruel setup. Deliberate, calculated, filmed. The men behind her clinked glasses, murmuring something she couldn't fully hear, but she caught the word viral, and her chest constricted. She gripped the edge of the table, nails biting into the linen. She wanted to scream. She wanted to walk out. She wanted to tell Daniel everything and run as fast as she could from this moment that was collapsing around her like a trap. But then Lily's voice echoed faintly through her memory. "Will he be nice to you, Mommy?" Emma swallowed hard. She looked at Daniel again, really looked, at the kindness in his expression, at the nervousness he tried to hide, at the gentleness that seemed to radiate from someone who had probably been misunderstood more times than she could imagine. She inhaled slowly, letting the air settle in her chest until her heart stopped pounding so loudly in her ears. And in that fragile breath, something inside her shifted, not a break but a realignment. If she walked out now, they won. If she cried, they won. If she lashed out, they filmed it and won even more. Emma straightened her spine, let her shoulders drop back, and lifted her chin with a quiet, stubborn dignity she had carried all her life. The trap was there, yes, but she didn't have to step into it the way they expected. She could choose something else, something stronger, something they would never see coming, and as she looked at Daniel, patient, warm, unknowingly part of their cruelty, she felt the first spark of that choice flicker in her chest. Emma tried to hold herself together as the minutes crawled by, but every second at that table felt like standing under a spotlight she hadn't agreed to. Daniel offered her a shy, apologetic smile each time he misread her words, and she offered one back, even though her chest felt tight and hollow. She kept trying, speaking softer, clearer, leaning forward just enough that he could see her lips. Still, the rhythm between them faltered like a song with missing notes. Behind her, the laughter grew. Not loud but sharp, focused, intentional. She reached for her water glass with hands that trembled just a little. The ice clinked softly, and the sound seemed to echo in the warm hush of the restaurant. She tried again to speak, forming a question about his day. But before she finished, a burst of stifled giggling rose from the table behind her. A chair scraped, a phone slid across linen. Emma felt the heat climb the back of her neck like a warning she couldn't ignore anymore. Something was wrong, more wrong than she had let herself believe. Daniel watched her, politely confused, clearly trying his best, and the sincerity in his eyes made the cruelty behind her feel even sharper. She forced a small smile and looked away to gather herself, and that was when she saw it. In the reflective glass of the restaurant window, dim but unmistakable, she saw the shapes of 3 phones all pointed toward her table, lenses glinting under warm lights like small predatory eyes. Her breath caught. Her heartbeat thudded once, hard and sickening. Emma turned her head slightly, just enough to catch the edge of the table behind her, Jordan leaning forward, Matt biting his fist to stop laughing, Luis pretending to adjust his napkin while recording. They weren't hiding it. They weren't ashamed. They were waiting for the moment she broke. A cold wave of humiliation washed through her so suddenly she felt lightheaded. She swallowed, trying to push the burn down. But it rose anyway. Shame, yes, but something deeper too. Betrayal, anger, a brutal kind of clarity that snapped everything into focus. She looked back at Daniel, her breath trembling. And that was when she saw the hearing aid clearly, really saw it, the tiny flash of molded plastic behind his ear, a detail she had missed before, a truth that snapped into place like a puzzle piece, falling exactly where it belonged. He was deaf. He wasn't pretending. And they had chosen him for that reason. Her vision blurred. A memory bloomed from a place she had buried long ago. A small boy with round eyes and a smile too big for his face. Her brother tracing shapes in the air, spelling words, laughing as she tried to keep up. She remembered the silent hospital room where machines hummed in low tones, where she told him stories with her hands when his eyes were too tired to stay open. She remembered the last time he signed thank you to her, slowly, lovingly, with trembling fingers. The sound around her faded until all she could hear was her own breathing, choppy and uneven. Daniel lifted his eyebrows gently, trying to understand her expression, offering her a small, hopeful smile, and behind her a whispered voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Dude, this is gold. Keep filming." Emma froze. That was it. The moment everything cracked. Humiliation flushed hot beneath her skin, colliding with grief, colliding with anger so deep it almost scared her. She felt tears hover, but refused to let them fall. Not for them, not in front of their cameras. She closed her eyes for a single, long breath, a trembling inhale that felt like standing on the edge of something enormous. When she opened them again, Daniel was still watching her with that gentle confusion, still unaware he had been brought here not for a date, but for a spectacle. Emma reached for her napkin, Gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles whitened, she forced her hands to unclench, forced the air into her lungs, forced the humiliation down until it hardened into something else. Resolve. A different kind of silence filled her, not frightened or broken, but steady, strong, defiant. She inhaled again, slower this time, and lifted her gaze toward Daniel. No yelling, no running, no giving them what they came for. If they were expecting a meltdown, they would be disappointed. If they were expecting humiliation, they would be denied it. Emma let her shoulders fall back, let her spine straighten, let the memory of her brother guide her next movement. Then, with hands trembling from emotion but steady with purpose, she lifted them into the air between herself and Daniel, softly, slowly, with a grace she hadn't used in years. Her fingers formed the first delicate shapes of a language older than her pain, older than their cruelty, older than any joke they thought they were telling. And as the first sign bloomed in the warm light of the restaurant, the laughter behind her fell into an uneasy, cracking silence, a silence that would change everything. For a moment that felt suspended outside of time, Emma's hands hovered in the soft glow of the candlelight, trembling not from fear, but from something deeper, something old, buried, and suddenly awake. The restaurant noise blurred into a distant hum as Daniel watched her fingers shape the hesitant, fragile signs of an apology. "I'm sorry," she told him, the movement small and aching. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Daniel blinked, and something inside his expression shifted, first confusion, then recognition, and then a quiet sorrow that softened every line of his face. He had the look of someone who had learned to decode disappointment the way others read weather. Instinctively, silently, without surprise. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his own hands. "It's not your fault," he signed. "You don't owe me an apology." The kindness in those gestures nearly undid her. Emma lowered her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, but memory slipped past her defenses anyway, her brother's hands spelling clumsy letters against her wrist, the weight of hospital blankets, the sweetness of small victories in a language that belonged only to the two of them. She hadn't signed in years. The muscles remembered, but the heart, oh, the heart remembered even more fiercely. Daniel leaned forward slightly, curiosity stirring through the sorrow. "You sign well." "How?" Emma's voice failed, so she let her fingers answer. "My little brother. He was deaf." She hesitated, the next sign harder to form. "He's gone." Daniel's eyes softened with a tenderness that made the humiliation at her back feel unbearably sharp. He lowered his gaze for a moment, then looked at her again with a gentleness that steadied her shaking hands. The room around them glowed with warm Christmas lights, but Emma felt suddenly exposed, as if the past had risen like a tide to meet the present. A soft voice behind her, too close, too amused, broke through the fragile quiet. "Dude, she's signing now. Get this. This is perfect." Emma went rigid. The humiliation she had pushed down all evening surged again, cold and electrifying. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could hear the smirk in the voice, feel the phones pointed at the back of her head like tiny, indifferent weapons. The betrayal was complete now, visible, undeniable, aimed straight at the part of her she had told nobody about for years. Daniel noticed the shift in her eyes. His expression darkened, not with anger, but with a kind of weary, protective clarity. "They're recording us," he signed, the movements crisp and sure. "Aren't they?" Emma nodded once. It was all she could manage. Daniel's jaw tightened. People like that. They don't understand anything. A waiter approached quietly, as if afraid to break the fragile bubble around the two of them. He bent down slightly, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, do you want me to intervene? They've been filming for a while. It isn't allowed." Emma hesitated. Her instinct was to say yes, to call them out, to demand justice, to reclaim the dignity they had tried to strip from her. But her breath faltered, and she looked at Daniel instead. His eyes held hers, calm but waiting, as if he were telling her without words, "This choice is yours. I'll follow your lead." For the first time that night, Emma realized she wasn't carrying this humiliation alone. She exhaled slowly. "Just don't let it get worse," she whispered to the waiter. He nodded deeply, understanding that she needed protection, not spectacle. He slipped away with quiet determination. Daniel's hands moved again, drawing her attention back to the small, intimate space between them. "You don't owe them a reaction," he signed. "Don't give them what they came for." Emma swallowed hard. The words hit somewhere deep. She had spent her whole life shrinking so other people wouldn't laugh, apologizing for existing, bending under pressures that were never hers to carry. Tonight, she wasn't sure she had the strength to fight, but she suddenly knew she had the strength not to break. Her hands lifted again, faintly trembling but steadier than before. "I don't want to run," she signed. "I'm tired of running." Daniel nodded, something like pride in his eyes. "Then don't." A silence settled between them, not the uncomfortable kind, but the heavy, sacred kind that happens right before a truth arrives. It pressed around their table like a shield, dulling the sound of camera clicks and smothered laughs behind them. In that silence, Emma made a choice. Not to retaliate, not to crumble. Not to give them a single tear they could replay in a group chat later. She would reclaim this moment, not for them, not even for herself, but for the man across from her who deserved better than to be turned into a joke. She let her fingers rest lightly on the table, ready to speak again, the only way that felt honest. And behind her, the men shifted in their seats, something uneasy threading through their laughter, as if they sensed the power in the room changing hands, even though they had no idea why. The night that had begun as a trap was starting to become something else, a crucible, a choice, a quiet beginning they would all remember. The air around their table felt different now, still tense, still fragile, but infused with a strange, quiet courage Emma hadn't felt in years. It settled over her like a thin coat of warmth, enough to keep her steady, even as humiliation still flickered at the edges of her thoughts. Daniel watched her, with an expression so gentle it almost hurt, as if he could see every fracture inside her, and wasn't frightened by any of them. Emma lifted her hands again, slowly, deliberately, choosing each movement like it mattered. And it did. "Thank you," she signed, the gesture small but sincere. Daniel shook his head with a soft smile, signing back, "Don't thank me, we're in this together." The words hit somewhere deep, where loneliness had settled for far too long. She held his gaze, letting herself breathe in that truth. Behind her, the voices of her coworkers dimmed, not because they had stopped laughing, but because the moment she shared with Daniel was louder in its silence. The cameras that once felt like spotlights now felt small, insignificant, pathetic. Emma no longer sat in a trap. She sat at a table with a man who met her where she was, without judgment, without cruelty. Something inside her loosened. A knot she hadn't realized she'd carried began to unravel. The waiter returned quietly, placing 2 menus down with a respectful nod. His eyes flickered toward the table behind them, then back to Emma, silently promising he hadn't forgotten her request. She gave him the smallest nod of gratitude. Daniel watched the exchange with understanding, then lifted his hands again. "Let's enjoy dinner," he signed. "Not for them, for us." Emma hadn't expected those words. She blinked, startled by the tenderness of the offer. For us. The truth was simple. She didn't know when someone had last suggested doing something kind for her without wanting anything in return. She didn't know when she had last allowed herself to accept it. She felt the corners of her mouth lift into a fragile but genuine smile. She signed, slowly but clearly, "I'd like that." Daniel signaled for water, then gestured for her to choose first from the menu. They slipped into a quiet, halting conversation, half signing, half reading each other's expressions, half acknowledging that this strange night had become something neither of them expected. Emma found herself laughing softly, the sound surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise Daniel. His eyes crinkled warmly, and for a moment the weight of the room lifted. Other diners began to notice them, not as a spectacle, not as entertainment, but as two people having a moment that somehow felt more real than the polished perfection around them. Curious eyes softened. A couple at a nearby table smiled, watching Emma sign with a kind of admiration that made her cheeks warm. The room itself seemed to shift, not dramatically but gently, like a tide turning. The first real light of hope came unexpectedly. A waiter from another section approached their table, leaning close enough that only Emma could hear. "Ma'am," he whispered, nodding subtly toward the recording men, "the manager asked if you want them removed. Just say the word." Emma glanced at Daniel, uncertainty flickering across her face. She didn't want a scene. She didn't want this night to become another moment of chaos in a life already full of noise. Daniel watched her, read her expression, and signed softly. "Your choice." Her choice. A sentence she wasn't used to holding. After a moment she shook her head gently. "Not yet," she whispered to the waiter. "Thank you." He nodded, stepping away again, but his posture said he was ready if she changed her mind. Emma felt protected, for the first time in a long time, even if no one else in the room knew why. Daniel signed again, his hands slower, more deliberate. "People see more than you think." Emma looked around. It was true. The laughter behind her had dulled to a nervous murmur. The men filming looked less amused now, their shoulders tightening, their confidence faltering. She wasn't giving them humiliation. She wasn't giving them anger. She wasn't even giving them fear. She was giving them something they hadn't prepared for: dignity, connection, humanity, and that more than anything seemed to unsettle them. Emma exhaled softly, letting the warmth of this unexpected shift fill her chest. She reached for her glass again, this time her hand steadier, and took a small drink. When she set it down, she let her fingers rest near Daniel's on the table, close enough that their hands were separated by only an inch of white linen. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was a beginning, a fragile, trembling beginning pulled from the ashes of a cruel joke. And somewhere behind them, the three men realized the evening was no longer unfolding according to their script. And for the first time that night, Emma felt a quiet, growing sense that something like justice was stirring beneath the surface. The night followed Emma home like a shadow that refused to loosen its grip. After stepping inside the apartment, she hung her coat carefully on the hook, as if gentleness could keep the evening from breaking any further. Lily was already half asleep on the neighbor's couch, and Emma carried her to bed, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek with the tenderness that always steadied her. Only when the child's breathing fell into its soft rhythm did Emma allow herself to sink into the worn couch, letting the silence wrap around her trembling frame. She replayed the dinner again in her mind, not the humiliation, not the cameras, but the quieter things, the warmth of candlelight on Daniel's face, the patience in his eyes, the unexpected safety she felt when his hands rose gently into the space between them, offering understanding without pity. A part of her still hurt, yes, but another part, one she hadn't felt in years, was beginning to lift its head again. Hope. Fragile, uncertain, but real. Her phone buzzed softly on the cushion beside her. A new message through the dating app. "Thank you for tonight. You were stronger than anyone else in that room." It was from Daniel. Emma let out a slow breath, the tension loosening from her shoulders. She stared at the message for a long moment before replying, "Thank you. I'm sorry you were dragged into something so thoughtless." The response came quickly, like he'd been waiting. "Cruelty says everything about the people who choose it. You didn't." Then, after a pause, "If you ever want to talk again, without an audience, I'd like that." Emma pressed her hand to her chest, caught off guard by how deeply the words settled into her. She whispered a thank you to no one in particular, placed the phone on the arm of the couch, and closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel the quiet sweetness of being treated with care. Across the city, Daniel sat alone in a high-rise hotel room lit only by the desk lamp. The folder on the table bore the Syntech Solutions logo, the company he had been evaluating for months, the one he was preparing to acquire. He opened the packet again, reviewing the pages with a sharper focus now that the night had shifted something inside him. Financials, organizational charts, culture reports, notes on workplace behavior. He paused when he reached the section labeled Employee Conduct and Workplace Climate. The summary was blunt: high turnover, low morale, reports of harassment not escalated by management. His jaw tightened. He scrolled further until a name caught his eye. Customer Support Division. A low-priority department, severely understaffed, described as a culture risk area. He recognized the phrasing. It meant problems ignored until they became unavoidable. A small photo was clipped to the page, an employee ID badge, Emma's badge. Daniel stared at it for a long moment, the weight of recognition steady and unflinching. He remembered her trembling hands, her dignity under pressure, her bravery in the face of cruelty. He remembered the laughter aimed at her and the steadiness with which she rose above it. Now, seeing her name in the folder, something inside him crystallized. He reached for his notebook, opened it to a new page, and began writing with slow, deliberate strokes. Evaluate true culture from the bottom up. Beneath it, another line. Meet support staff personally. Then quietly, Emma's perspective matters. He closed the notebook. The decision, though unwritten in any official document, had already taken root. The acquisition would not be just about cost or numbers. Not anymore. Not after what he had seen. Meanwhile, Emma turned out the lights one by one, pausing at Lily's doorway before slipping into her own room. She didn't know that the man she had sat across from was already entangled in the future of her entire workplace. She didn't know that the humiliation she faced had awakened in him a resolve he rarely felt in business. She didn't know that destiny, quiet and unhurried, was circling back to her in ways no one could predict. As she lay down, her last thought was simple and soft. Tonight could have broken me. But it didn't. She drifted into sleep, unaware that by morning, the path of her life, and the path of the man who witnessed her courage, would begin to move toward each other again. This time with purpose. The first workday after the holidays dawned grey and unforgiving, the kind of morning that made the city feel heavier than usual. Emma sat on the bus with Lily's drawing folded carefully in her bag, a crooked snowman with 2 big buttons, and the words, "I love you, Mommy," scrawled underneath. The promise of that love warmed her more than the weak heating rattling through the bus vents. Her stomach fluttered with the usual knots of worry: rent, groceries, the lingering memory of Christmas Eve. She told herself she just had to get through the day, one call, one email, one breath at a time. At Syntech, the air felt charged the moment she stepped through the revolving doors. Clusters of employees stood in the lobby, talking in low, excited voices, glancing nervously toward the elevators. A digital notice glowed on the wall: all staff meeting, 10 a.m., mandatory. Emma's badge beeped green at the turnstile, but the sound felt strangely loud, like a gavel. Around her, people speculated in half-sentences about the investor, each version bigger and more exaggerated than the last. On the support floor, the tension thickened. Phones rang, headsets buzzed, but everyone's eyes kept flicking to the clock. Emma slipped into her cubicle, dropping her bag by the chair, noticing her hands were colder than they should be. She tried to focus on her first call, but the customer's voice blurred as her mind wandered back to Daniel's messages, the quiet strength in his words, the way he'd written you were stronger than anyone else in that room. She had read that line 3 times before falling asleep. Near the coffee station, Jordan and Matt stood huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers that didn't quite match their forced chuckles. Luis hovered nearby, his gaze darting across the room like a trapped bird. When Emma approached to pour herself a thin, bitter coffee, their conversation died mid-sentence. The silence between them wasn't the usual easy smugness. It was brittle, strained. She felt their eyes on her back as she walked away, and for once, the discomfort seemed to be theirs, not hers. At 5 minutes to 10, the entire floor emptied into the corridor, the stream of employees funneling toward the auditorium at the center of the building. Emma took a seat near the back, keeping her coat folded over her lap, grateful for the distance. The room buzzed with speculative energy, some hopeful, some fearful, all restless. On the stage at the front, the company logo pulsed faintly on a massive screen, flanked by 2 microphones and a small table with water glasses lined up like props for a performance. The CEO appeared first, smiling just a little too wide, flanked by a pair of executives Emma had only seen in elevator reflections and company newsletters. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice booming through the speakers. He talked about a new chapter, strategic partnerships, and transformational growth, each phrase polished within an inch of its life. Emma stared at her hands resting in her lap instead, feeling more and more like a spectator in a story written far above her head. "And now," the CEO said at last, "I'd like to introduce the man who has taken a deep interest in SynTech's future, a leader in inclusive technology and responsible investment. Please welcome Daniel Cole." Emma's heart stopped. Time seemed to slow, every sound stretching thin and distant. A man walked onto the stage, suit impeccably tailored, posture composed, a discreet hearing aid catching the overhead light. An interpreter stepped beside him, ready. Emma's breath returned in a rush that felt like a shock. It was him, Daniel, the man from the restaurant, the man who had seen her at her most exposed, the man she had spoken to, not with words, but with her hands. He scanned the room briefly as he reached the center of the stage, not searching, but taking in the space with the calm assessment of someone used to rooms like this. When his gaze swept past the back rows, Emma shrank slightly into her seat, overwhelmed by the collision of worlds. The auditorium was utterly silent now. Behind her she heard a sharp inhale, a whispered curse, Jordan's voice suddenly small. The 3 men who had filmed her humiliation were frozen in their seats, faces pale, eyes wide with dawning horror. Daniel began to sign, his movements measured and precise, his expression composed. The interpreter's voice carried his words through the room. "Good morning. I'm honored to be here. When I evaluate a company, I don't start with profit. I start with people." His gaze moved slowly over the crowd, and though he didn't stop on her, Emma felt as if every sentence was somehow meant for her. "How a company treats its most vulnerable employees tells me everything I need to know." A murmur rippled through the rows. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears. Vulnerable. That word lodged in her chest like a stone. Daniel continued, signing with quiet intensity as the interpreter followed. "I could stand here and talk about numbers, about systems, about strategy. But instead I want to tell you a story. It happened here, in this city just a few nights ago, on Christmas Eve. Emma's fingers dug into the fabric of her coat. The room, which had been full of restless shifting, fell still. A few people leaned forward. Others exchanged puzzled glances. Behind her, she could feel the panic radiating from the men who had orchestrated the joke, their breathing shallow, their bodies suddenly too small in their seats. Daniel spoke calmly, but there was steel beneath his tone. I met a woman that night, a single mother, exhausted, underpaid, undervalued. Her colleagues thought it would be entertaining to use her loneliness and my deafness as material for a joke. The interpreter's words hung heavy in the air. They filmed us. They laughed. They expected humiliation. Emma's throat closed. Heat rushed to her face, though nobody had turned to look at her, yet. The image of the restaurant flashed across her mind, the phones, the laughter, the moment everything changed. But, Daniel continued, his hands cutting through the air with quiet conviction, instead of breaking, this woman chose dignity. She chose kindness. She chose to speak my language when no one expected her to. While others laughed, she showed me, and everyone watching, what real character looks like. Somewhere in the middle rows, someone shifted uncomfortably. A few heads turned, scattering glances across the room, as if trying to match the story to a face. Emma stared straight ahead, breathing in shallow, careful sips. The three men behind her were utterly silent now, their earlier bravado leaking out of them like air from a punctured balloon. And that night, Daniel said, pausing just long enough to let the tension coil tighter, changed the way I see this company, and the way I will decide its future. Bye. He let his hands fall to his sides for a moment, scanning the room with a gaze that seemed to weigh hearts rather than resumes. Because culture is not what's written on the walls. It's what happens when no one thinks they are being watched. A hush fell over the room so complete that Emma could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. She felt as if the floor itself were tilting beneath her. Daniel drew in a slow breath, lifted his hands again, and said, through the interpreter, "So before I make any decision about Syntech, I intend to speak with that woman, and with the people who treated her as entertainment." His eyes moved across the sea of faces, and this time they stopped. Somewhere between the stage and the back row, his gaze found Emma. And in that charged, breathless second, surrounded by colleagues, managers, and the men who had tried to turn her into a joke, Emma understood that nothing in her life was going to stay the same. For a long heartbeat, nothing moved. Daniel's gaze held Emma's from across the room, not accusing, not pitying, just seeing her fully, in a way that made her want to disappear and stand up at the same time. Then, slowly, he looked away, letting his attention sweep across the rows of faces before him. "Some of you were there that night," the interpreter said as Daniel signed. "Some of you watched, some of you recorded." The words dropped like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of discomfort through the crowd. Near the middle of the auditorium, Jordan shifted in his seat, his hand dragging over his jaw. Matt's leg bounced restlessly, the motion sharp and jittery. Louis stared down at his hands, knuckles white where they gripped the armrests. Emma could feel their panic without turning around to see their faces. It hung in the air between them, like something sour and dense. She gripped her coat tighter, wishing she could shrink into the fabric, yet somehow unable to look away from the man on the stage. Daniel's hands moved again, calm and precise. "I did not bring lawyers," the interpreter translated. "I did not bring security." He paused. "I brought a question." The auditorium seemed to tighten around that single word. "What kind of place do you want this to be?" he signed. "One where cruelty is entertainment, or one where people are more important than your group chats and your jokes?" A murmur rose, then died just as quickly. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to breathe too loudly in case it drew attention. Emma felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure the people beside her could hear it. She knew, with the cold clarity of someone who has stood under judgment before, that this was not just about an investor or a company. It was about who would choose to stay small and who would choose to step into the light. Daniel's expression remained steady, but there was iron under the calm. "If you were part of what happened that night," he signed, his gaze skimming over the rows, "I'm giving you the chance to speak up now, not because I want to destroy you, but because honesty is the first test of whether this place deserves a second chance." The interpreter's voice echoed off the walls, and then the room fell into a silence so complete that even the hum of the air conditioning seemed suddenly too loud. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then, from somewhere a few rows ahead of Emma, a chair scraped the floor. Jordan stood up. His face was pale, his usual lazy smile gone, replaced by a tight, brittle line. "It was just a joke," he blurted, his voice too loud in the stillness. We didn't think it would go that far." His hands fluttered helplessly at his sides. "We thought she would laugh it off. It was stupid. Okay? We're sorry." The word joke hit Emma like a slap. She stared at the back of Jordan's head, at the line of his shoulders, at the way he managed to make an apology sound like he was the one unfairly cornered. Murphy from HR shifted in her seat, eyes narrowing. Several people in the crowd folded their arms, uncomfortable now that the abstract story had solid faces attached to it. Daniel watched Jordan for a long, quiet moment, then signed again, his movement slower, more deliberate. The interpreter's voice stayed calm, but there was no mistaking the weight of the words. "You thought my deafness was funny," he said. "You thought her financial struggle was funny. Tell me." Daniel paused, his gaze never leaving Jordan's. "At what point did it stop being a joke for you? When she cried, when she signed, or when you found out I was the one standing here?" Jordan's mouth opened, then closed. No sound came out. Matt stared rigidly ahead, jaw clenched, as if he could avoid being seen by refusing to move. Luis swallowed hard, his eyes glossed with something that looked a lot like regret, but he stayed in his seat, pinned there by a mixture of shame and fear. "You hid behind your phones," Daniel continued, a sharp flick of his fingers underscoring the words, "behind each other, behind the idea that she wouldn't fight back, that nobody important would ever know." He let that sink in, and the silence that followed felt like a mirror held up to the entire room. "Well," he signed, his hands settling for a moment, "now I know, and now your colleagues know. The question is, what do you do with that?" Daniel turned slightly, looking toward the executives seated at the front row. "A culture that allows this is already broken," the interpreter relayed. "But a culture that refuses to change when confronted with the truth is beyond saving." He nodded once, firmly. "I don't invest in places that are beyond saving." Then he looked back at the employees, at the sea of faces caught between shame and relief, that it wasn't them in the spotlight. "I don't want a witch hunt," he signed. "I want honesty, I want growth. That means there will be consequences." He held up a hand before anyone could react. But consequences and destruction are not the same thing. Emma's pulse thudded in her ears. Consequences. She thought of Lily's jar of coins for field trips, of rent, of late-night bus rides. She thought of the 3 men who had laughed at her pain and now sat frozen in it. And she thought of herself, invisible until the night she refused to be. Somewhere deep in her chest, something braced for impact. Daniel's gaze shifted again, softer now, searching the back rows where she sat. "There's one more person I need to hear from," he signed. "The woman who stood up without standing at all. The woman who chose compassion when cruelty would have been easier." He nodded toward the aisle, his eyes finding her with unerring certainty. "Emma," the interpreter said, voice steady, If you're willing, would you come down and tell us how that night felt from where you were sitting?" Every head in the room turned. Eyes found her, some curious, some guilty, some quietly admiring. Emma's fingers tightened on her coat, and in the thick, charged silence that followed, she understood that whatever she did next would not only rewrite how they saw her, it might just rewrite how she saw herself. For a moment, Emma couldn't move. Her name seemed to hang in the air above the auditorium, hovering there between Daniel's calm gaze and the hundreds of eyes now turned toward her. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her legs felt heavy, and a familiar voice whispered in the back of her mind, "Stay small, stay quiet, survive." But another voice, newer, quieter, rooted in the memory of her hands moving in the restaurant's candlelight, whispered something else. "Stand up." She drew in a shaky breath and rose. The fabric of her coat brushed against her knees as she stepped into the aisle, every footfall sounding too loud in the hush. No one spoke. No one laughed. The men who had filmed her hunched in their seats, trying to disappear, but there was nowhere to hide. Emma walked down the steps toward the front, her palms damp, her throat dry, resisting the urge to turn and run. When she reached the bottom, Daniel gave a small nod of greeting, a quiet anchor in the storm. A microphone waited for her on a stand. Someone adjusted it down to her height, and the gesture felt almost unbearably kind. She stared at it for a second, then lifted her eyes to the crowd. Faces swam before her, some guilty, some curious, some startled by the fact that the woman they'd barely noticed in the hallways was now standing where only executives usually stood. Emma swallowed. Her voice, when it came, was softer than she meant, but it carried. "On Christmas Eve," she began, "I thought I was going on a normal date." Her gaze flickered to the side, then back. "I got dressed up in the only nice dress I own. I left my daughter with a neighbor. I told her I'd be back with a story about a nice man and a good dinner." She took a breath, her fingers curling around the edge of the podium. "Instead, I walked into a performance I hadn't agreed to be a part of." She didn't look at the three men by name, but she didn't have to. "I knew something was wrong when I saw the phones," she said. "When I heard the laughter, when I realized they had chosen a deaf man for me without telling me, not because they cared if we connected, but because they wanted to see what would happen when they put two people they thought were less than on display." The words tasted bitter, but they came steadily now, each one rooted in something true. "I was embarrassed," she continued, voice tightening. "But I wasn't just embarrassed for myself. I thought about my brother, who was deaf. I thought about all the times people talked around him like he wasn't there, or joked about him like he couldn't understand, just because he couldn't hear." She paused, blinking back the sting of tears. "And I looked at Daniel and realized they weren't just laughing at me, they were laughing at him. At all of us who've ever been made into a punchline because we don't fit someone else's idea of normal or successful." The room was utterly silent. Executives watched with sober faces. HR shifted forward, listening more intently than any policy document had ever made them. Emma's hands trembled on the podium, but her spine felt straighter than it had in years. "I could have yelled. I could have walked out," she said. "Part of me wanted to. But instead, I remembered the language my brother left me, so I used my hands." Her voice softened, but somehow grew stronger. "I apologized to Daniel for what they were doing, for what they thought was funny. I told him it wasn't about us. It was about them. I did it in sign language because I wanted him to know that, in that room, at least one person respected him." She glanced at Daniel, and his eyes shone with a quiet gratitude that steadied her all over again. "That's what happened," she finished. "I went home humiliated, but I also went home knowing I hadn't become what they wanted me to be. I didn't break. I didn't help them make their video. I chose respect, even when I wasn't being given any." She let her gaze sweep the crowd for the first time. I'm not perfect. I'm not important here. I'm just a support rep, a single mom, someone most of you have probably walked past without remembering. But I'm not a joke, and neither is he. When she stepped back from the microphone, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, reverent, almost fragile. Then someone near the back began to clap. Another joined, and then, like a wave finally allowed to crest, the room filled with applause, not wild, not performative, but deep and sustained. Emma's cheeks flushed, not with shame this time, but with a stunned, disbelieving warmth. She caught sight of the three men. Jordan's head was bowed, Matt stared at the floor, and Luis looked like he might be sick. None of them were smiling. Daniel lifted a hand gently, and the room quieted again. He signed slowly, clearly, his eyes never leaving Emma as the interpreter spoke. "Thank you," he said. "What you just heard is what I wish more leaders would listen to before they ask for numbers." He turned slightly toward the executives. "This company has a problem. Not just with three men who made a cruel choice, but with a culture that let them think it would be harmless." He drew a breath, his expression firm. "There will be consequences," he went on, "for those directly involved and for those who looked away. That is not revenge. That is responsibility." His gaze flicked toward the front row, where HR and leadership sat very still. "I will recommend disciplinary action, mandatory training, and a full review of management practices in departments where this kind of behavior has gone unchecked." Then his tone shifted, gentler, as he looked back at Emma. "But I believe in second chances," he signed, "for people and for companies." The interpreter's voice softened to match. "If this place chooses to change, truly change, I am still willing to invest, not just money, but time, attention, accountability." He nodded toward Emma. "And I would like Emma to be part of that change." Murmurs rippled through the room. Emma blinked, startled. She understands what it means to be dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated. "I will be recommending a new role for her, working with leadership to help design better, more humane experiences for employees and customers. Someone who has felt the impact of cruelty should have a voice in building kindness into the system." Emma stared at him, stunned, her mind racing to catch up. A new role for her. For a moment, all she could think of was Lily's coin jar, the overdue bills, the exhaustion that lived permanently in her bones. Then, slowly, another thought rose. Maybe she was not meant to live her whole life at the bottom of the ladder, apologizing for taking up space. Daniel looked back at the room one last time. "This is your turning point," he signed, "for the men who made that choice, for the managers who ignored warning signs, for every person who watched and said nothing, and for Emma, who chose compassion when no one would have blamed her for walking away." His hands came to rest at his sides. "The question now is simple," the interpreter finished. "What do you do with this moment?" As Emma walked back up the aisle to her seat, knees still unsteady but heart strangely lighter, she knew the answer wouldn't come in a single day or a single decision. It would come in what happened next, in apologies given or avoided, in policies changed or ignored, in whether people met her eyes in the hallway or looked away. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt something like justice, brushing against the edges of her life, not perfect, not complete, but real. And as she sat down, fingers still faintly trembling, she allowed herself one small, radical thought. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't only the turning point for the company. Maybe it was the turning point for her too. In the weeks that followed the meeting, the building felt different, as if someone had quietly opened a window in a room that had been stale for years. Posters about company values were replaced with listening sessions. not just slogans, and people who had never spoken up in meetings began to ask careful, necessary questions. Emma watched all of this from a new seat, no longer in the crowded support floor, but at a small desk near a glass wall, her badge now bearing a new title she could hardly believe: Experience and Culture Liaison. The word still felt too big for her, like a coat a size too large, but each day she grew into them a little more. She still answered calls sometimes, when the department needed help, but more often she sat with employees from different teams, listening to the stories they had never thought anyone cared to hear. She took notes on moments of kindness and moments of cruelty, on jokes that cut too deep and managers who stepped in or looked away. Then in quiet meetings with HR and leadership, she translated those stories into suggestions, small, practical changes that might keep someone else from going home feeling as invisible as she once had. It was slow work, imperfect, but it mattered in ways spreadsheets never could. As for the men from that night, their lives did not end, but they did change. Jordan was suspended, then returned at a lower position, his easy swagger muted, his eyes less quick to roll when serious topics came up. Matt was transferred to a different team under stricter supervision, spending his days doing quiet, unglamorous work that left little room for mischief. Luis, the only one who had truly seemed shaken, asked to meet with Emma. In a small conference room, with his hands twisting in his lap, he offered a halting, sincere apology. No excuses, no jokes, just a man facing the truth of who he had been and who he wanted to be instead. She didn't forget what he'd done, but she chose to believe he could change, the way she hoped the whole place could. Daniel visited the office more often now, not as a distant figure in a suit, but as a presence people grew accustomed to seeing in the halls. Sometimes he sat in on Emma's sessions, watching her sign and speak, offering quiet comments afterward about what he'd seen in other companies and what he believed they could build here. Other times he stopped by her desk for reasons that had very little to do with strategy, to ask about Lily's latest drawing, to share a story about his travels, to simply sit for a moment in comfortable silence. One afternoon, Lily herself came to the office, wide-eyed and curious, and Daniel knelt to her level and signed "Nice to meet you," making her giggle as she tried to copy the shapes with her small fingers. On a late winter evening, as the office emptied and the city lights flickered on outside, Emma stood by the window, watching the snow gather softly on the streets below. She thought about where she had been just weeks before, at a table under Christmas lights, feeling like a prop in someone else's cruel story, and where she stood now, with a voice she hadn't known she was allowed to use. Behind her she heard footsteps and turned to see Daniel, coat over his arm, offering her that quiet, steady smile she had come to trust. "Long day?" the interpreter asked, echoing his signed question. Emma smiled back, feeling something gentle and uncertain stir in her chest. "A good one," she said, "but I think the story's not finished yet." And as their eyes met in the fading light, the truth of that settled between them. Soft, unspoken, and full of possibilities, neither of them was quite ready to name. 1 year later, Christmas Eve looked very different in Emma's small apartment. The lights were the same cheap string she had used for years, but somehow they glowed warmer now, reflected in clean windows and a freshly painted wall Lily had helped choose. The table, though modest, was set with care. Second-hand plates that almost matched, cloth napkins she'd bought on sale, a simple roast that filled the room with a rich, comforting scent. Lily buzzed around in socked feet, placing paper snowflakes at each seat as if she were arranging treasures in a museum. Daniel sat at the table, rolling a tiny paper snowflake between his fingers, watching Emma move between the stove and the counter with a softness in his eyes that spoke of gratitude more than anything else. He wore no suit tonight, just a sweater Lily had pointed at in a shop window weeks earlier, insisting it was exactly his color. When Emma finally sat down, breathless and laughing, he signed, "You did all this," and she shook her head, signing back, "We did." The word we still felt new on her hands, but it fit. Dinner was simple, but it tasted like abundance. They shared stories between bites, Lily explaining every glitter-smeared ornament on their small tree, Daniel recounting a childhood memory of silent Christmas carols he felt through vibration and light, Emma telling a story about her brother that made them both quiet for a moment, in the best possible way. At one point, Lily asked if her uncle in heaven could see the signs from where he was, and Emma's eyes shone as she answered, "I think he sees all of this." The silence that followed was not sad, only full. News of what had happened at Syntec had long since faded from gossip, but its effects remained. The three men who'd filmed her were no longer the same. Jordan now volunteered once a month at a community center, teaching younger employees how not to become the kind of man he once had been. Matt had stopped making people the butt of his jokes, discovering slowly that he was still funny when he was kind. Luis checked in on Emma occasionally, not as penance, but as a quiet friend who never again treated someone's pain like a game. The company itself was gentler, slower to laugh at the wrong things, quicker to listen. Later that night, after dishes were washed and Lily had fallen asleep on the couch under a too small blanket, Emma and Daniel stood by the window, watching soft flakes drift under the streetlights. She thought of where she had been a year ago, walking into a restaurant feeling small and unworthy, and where she stood now with a life that still wasn't easy, but was undeniably hers. "Funny," she murmured half to herself, "how a cruel joke became the best turning point of my life." Daniel smiled, signing because you chose who you were in it. Emma let that truth settle in her heart, warm and steady, then turned toward the future with a quiet, grateful courage. And somewhere, beyond the screen where this story is being told, if this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.